Yo, what is up? Welcome to Ninja Geek Games. So, Steamforged Games have recently announced the upcoming release of two new core sets for Dark Souls, the board game. If you cast your mind way back to 2016, Steamforged Games were able to successfully fund Dark Souls on Kickstarter. Ignoring the delay in getting these to backers, the game smashed its funding goal at nearly £4 million. However, throughout the tabletop community, the game has been received as a well-loved dungeon crawler by some, not so much by others. The main issues appear to be the fact the game was a long grind, taking nearly as long as the console game to complete, slow character development, and a poorly executed mechanic for gaining equipment, and a somewhat lackluster campaign. So, why did I like it? Firstly, I'm a big fan of dungeon crawlers, especially when they come with a lot of well-detailed miniatures. I like the IP, and I think some of the gameplay mechanics are quite intuitive, such as equipment use and endurance, as well as monster activation and boss battles, but I'll discuss these later. Now, you may be wondering as to why there are two more core sets on top of all the expansions already available. Can they be incorporated into the original base game, and what are the differences between these? In this video, I'm going to review the core sets together and look at gameplay mechanics and updated rules, as well as discuss some of the specific differences between them. I'm also going to detail as to why these two core sets have been introduced based on the updates from Steamforged Games, including content compatibility with the base game and working with the community to develop a better Dark Souls experience. Let's take a look. Each of these core sets is a standalone game where we have the Tomb of Giants and the Painted World of Ariamis. Although the original base game and expansions is one of my most played dungeon crawlers, and I've played the console games, I don't have a great deal of knowledge on the lore of these two games. They do promise a campaign style of play, where a party of characters progresses through multiple encounters to battle enemies and collect souls used to purchase equipment and upgrade stats, but ultimately you're required to fight a boss in order to win the game. The rules for each of these games are largely identical except for a few keywords, but the main differences will be found in the characters you select for your party, the enemies you'll face, and the equipment and encounters that you'll come across each game. Now, each of these games is for 1 to 3 players, which I found odd considering the original allowed for up to 4. However, small print on page 3 of the rulebook informs you that you can take any character from these sets to create a party of up to 4 players. Just don't forget to take character specific items with you when you do. There is an exception to this and I'll discuss that later. So, what's in the box? So this is most of the content for the Painted World and Tomb of the Giants core sets. I have left out some of the tokens and dice because they double up in both sets. Each game comes with 4 double-sided tiles where the encounters take place. Each character has their own player board and class-specific treasures, and with each set you get 5 or 6 different enemies with behaviour cards that dictate how they carry out their actions. Each set also comes with 2 types of bosses, a mini-boss and a main boss, that have a small deck of unique behaviour cards. There are a good handful of treasure cards that you can equip to your characters during the game, and the encounter cards indicate how map tiles are set up and which enemies you'll be facing. The game introduces event cards that are drawn after encounters, and this is the campaign board for storing souls and treasure cards and marking your progress through the dungeon. This has actually replaced the Bonfire tile from the last game. Lastly, there are a load of tokens to mark wounds, souls, conditions and traps to name a few, as well as 4 different types of custom dice. In Tomb of the Giants, most of the enemies are skeletons with 2 small and 2 giant types that attack in melee and ranged combat. The skeleton beast is a bit of a unit with high resistance and block values and can carry out its move action twice. Necromancers are pretty cool as they can resurrect skeleton soldiers at the end of their turn, so you'll need to defeat them pretty quickly. In the Painted World core set, these snow rats are the easiest enemy that cause poison, and the bone wheel skeletons roll around and have a higher dodge value. There are engorged zombies with a non-ranged magic attack, and crow demons that leap onto your character's space to deal quite a bit of damage. Lastly, there is the Phalanx Hollow, and these can group together and move around as one big unit. So these are the 4 bosses that you get in the games. Tomb of Giants has the Black Knight, where most of their attacks have long range and cause stagger conditions, as well as the Gravelord, whose battles include additional miniatures through spawning. In the Painted World, the Heavy Knight also causes stagger and can regenerate as well. And Priscilla can turn invisible, and quite a few attacks have conditions such as bleed and poison, which cause damage to the characters. First thing you notice is there's no "You Died" poster. Epic fail. For those new to the game, the components are very good, and that in general is pretty standard for all of Steamforged Games products. The miniatures are fantastic and very well detailed, and the artwork is great throughout. The inserts are very handy too. But there are a few things that concern me. Firstly, I don't know why the game was reduced to 3 players, and I know I've mentioned that characters from the core sets and previous expansions can be brought in, but there may be an exception to this that I'll discuss later when going over compatibility with the original game. The 6 characters in these 2 sets are actually those you'll find in the character expansion from the original game. I'm not too keen on the updated version of the playboards either. In the original base game, these were thick, double-layered boards with indented areas to sit cubes to mark stat increases, damage and stamina. Here, we're expected to punch out the tokens and push them back into the player boards to mark these, and you have to remember, especially for stamina and damage, you're going to be doing this quite often. I'm not convinced on the durability of the player boards when doing this, or what happens if you lose or mix up stat tokens with another player, so I'll be using the original cubes for this reason. Also, any equipment cards are placed off to the side rather than on top of the player board, so you may want to use the original ones if you have them. The campaign board is a new addition to the core sets, and this allows for a slightly smaller play area, as encounters are now only set up when starting them. I didn't mind the original setup where you had the bonfire tile surrounded by 4 other map tiles, as I've got a pretty big gaming table, but can see this really helps track progress in a more streamlined way. Here you have a track to mark areas that you have or are about to explore, that house the encounter cards and indicate where you meet the bosses. Treasure and event cards are stored along this row, and you also have areas for your soul cache and spark dial. Each player also starts the game with 3 character tokens to include luck for rerolls, Estus Flask for regaining health and stamina, and heroic action, which is a special ability indicated here. During the game, you'll also be able to increase your base stats in 4 areas to allow you to wield more powerful items. As mentioned, the aim of the game is to progress through the campaign to defeat the end boss. In order to do this, you'll need to complete encounters to gain better equipment, as enemies you meet get tougher, and so do any challenges associated with them. Some equipment you'll get from looting treasure chests or as rewards from defeating encounters, but for others you'll need to stop the game and enter a market-like area. Here you can rest, buy items and refresh your player boards, as well as increase your stats. But this resets the whole dungeon, and you'll have to start again, progressing through the encounters you've already completed. Doing this costs time, represented by a spark dial with a limited number of sparks based on your player count. This is called resting at the bonfire, that reduces the spark dial by 1. Run out of sparks and the game ends, so you have a push your luck element here. Do you power through a dungeon hoping to gain loads of rewards and souls to spend on development, or progress a little more carefully, noting that if any character dies during an encounter, you must return to the bonfire and risk losing your hard-earned souls? Let's take a look at an encounter. To set up an encounter, you move the party token to the next empty slot along the campaign track. Each game comes with 29 encounter cards at 3 different levels of difficulty. As you explore, you'll be drawing 2 cards from the required level and choosing which one of these to attempt. You'll then place this card under the party token. These cards now have a little more information on them. You have some flavour text as well as some additional areas that change how the encounter is played. First off, there is an objective, and this is what you need to achieve in order to defeat the encounter. In the special rules, there may be some keywords that affect you or the enemies, as well as unique rules specific to that encounter that changes how the game is played in some way. If you defeat the encounter by completing the objective, any rewards you gain are listed here. This is the map layout used to show the number of tiles in the encounter, their layout and where the characters will start. And some encounters have multiple tiles included on the map, giving you a larger area to explore. This area here indicates the number and type of enemies you'll be facing, as well as the location of any terrain. The highlighted number is the tile that your characters will start the encounter on. This is the biggest change of the game so far. Previously, you had the whole dungeon set up with an encounter card face down on each tile. You choose a tile, flip the encounter card and set up enemies and terrain. There was no objectives, special rules or rewards other than gaining a number of souls for killing all enemies. After defeating the encounter, you would then decide to rest at the bonfire or continue to the next tile. Doing it this way with the campaign board saves table space and does kind of give you that feeling you're exploring a new area with each encounter. You do, however, have this linear approach, so if you rest and want to hit that level 2 encounter, you'll have to progress through 3 level 1 encounters first. But Steamforged games have included shortcuts as one of the rewards for defeating some encounters. This is represented by a token being placed on the encounter card, meaning you can jump straight to that encounter from the bonfire. Other rewards include specific treasure items, which is good as some are generally related to the level that you're at, and refreshing used tokens, meaning you don't have to visit the Firekeeper and spend souls to do this anymore. Also, the first boss you meet is halfway down the campaign track. Defeat them and this area also acts as a shortcut, so for the remainder of the game you can completely ignore the first part of the track. During an encounter, enemies and characters will activate and carry out actions. First, all enemies will activate, then one character. Then all enemies activate again, followed by another character, and so on until the objective of the encounter is completed or one character has died. A single tile is made up of nodes that represent areas that miniatures can move to, and these have radiating light images that indicate the direction of the adjacent node. Each enemy has a behaviour card that dictates its health, range, its block and resist values, as well as how it attacks and moves. This is the move icon that shows whether the enemy moves towards or away from characters. And the attack icon can show physical or magical attacks, the strength of the attack and who the target is. The target of enemy movement or attacks is either the closest character to the enemy or the one with the aggro token, which is generally the character that activated last. Some enemies, such as the skeleton soldier, don't have attacks and instead cause damage just by moving onto the node that the character is on, shown by this push icon. When an enemy attacks, the behaviour card shows the damage that it will cause, and characters can either reduce this by blocking or negate by dodging, rolling dice associated with any items they have equipped. These icons along the bottom of the card show block, resist, dodge and any upgrades that they can equip. All the dice are rolled together, and if the character can meet or exceed the enemy dodge value, then they suffer no damage. Fail and the character will take damage equal to the difference between the strength of the attack and the value shown on the dice. The value in the top left of each behaviour card is the threat value of the enemy, which dictates the order of activation. Therefore, you can predict the movement and any attacks of the enemies. This defensive combat mechanic allows you to both block and dodge at the same time. Fail one and you may still have a chance of survival. Now, when I say block, you look at the enemy attack type and then collect a pool of dice to block a physical attack or resist magic, based on what equipment you have. Also, if you successfully dodge the attack, you can choose to spend stamina to move to an adjacent node to get out of harm's way or take a more advantageous position. This is actually another big change to the game. In the original base game, you had to choose one or the other, block or dodge. If you blocked or resisted, there was a chance you could negate some or all damage. If you chose to dodge, instead you had to spend stamina and move regardless of the result, and if you failed you took the full brunt of the attacker's damage, which was brutal. This was an all or nothing event where your decision relied heavily on your choice of equipment or whether you were insane enough to attempt a 1-die dodge from a strength 5 attack. Personally, I prefer the push your luck element, having to do one or the other, because it became a strategic part of the game and your character's development. To some it may feel a bit easier now, as with just one dodge dice you have a 50-50 success against most enemies without fear of failing. For character activation, it's fairly simple. You get to move and carry out one action, which could be to attack or interact with any terrain on the tile. When moving, you can only move to one adjacent node. But if you want to move further, you must run, and that costs additional stamina per extra node moved. To attack, you choose a weapon or a spell and pay for one of the actions using stamina. The heavy hits are likely to do more damage, and some will even have special effects, but these cost more stamina. You roll the number and type of dice indicated by the attack, and subtract any enemy block or resistant values where the difference is taken as damage. You can also use 2 weapons to attack if equipped, but this may cost a lot of stamina and replace use of a shield if you have one. The endurance bar on the player board is where stamina and damage is tracked, starting at different ends of the bar. If you need to place any token on this area but it's full, you die and the encounter fails, which is why choosing your attack carefully as well as how far you move is an important part of the game. In the original game, it was a little less forgiving as your character died once your endurance bar was full. So use too much stamina attacking and moving and you aren't able to take too much damage in the enemy activation phase. Or take a heavy hit and you may need to use the weaker attack of a weapon's action on your next turn. At the start of each character activation, you get to recover stamina from your player board, and here it's 3 tokens. In the previous game, you only recovered 2 tokens, so in these core sets, you seem to be having an easier ride. Also, before activating, other players are allowed to move their character 1 node, which is a new rule. This I really like and think it should be included as a house rule in the base game version, but again it can appear to give you another advantage on top of stamina recovery and the defensive combat rolls. So objectives, what do they do? Well, as seen, each encounter card informs you what the party has to do in order to win and claim the rewards. These are as simple as defeat all enemies, which is the same as the original game, but also include surviving oncoming hordes of enemies, taking on those that respawn, protecting a piece of terrain and activating levers that results in some effects taking place. Each encounter will also include special rules where there's a snowstorm, so characters keep taking on the frostbite condition unless they can claim a torch, or you must reduce the value of all character attacks, or the enemies getting some special ability making them harder to defeat or defend against. They add greater variability and replay value to the game, and I really enjoy exploring the multiple tiles in one encounter. For these, although you have multiple tiles set up, enemies will only activate on tiles that characters have been to. Now because of this, you may think that all you have to do is defeat all enemies on one tile and then just sit there taking turns doing nothing until all stamina is recovered before moving on. Not always. In Tomb of the Giants there are keywords on encounter cards where all enemies are active on multi-tile encounters, which is pretty cool. And other rule additions like a sweeping cloud of poison mist following you every step, and these add another level of strategy to your game. After completing an encounter, you now get event cards that help draw you into this immersive world. Some add NPCs you can buy equipment from or provide an ability you can use next encounter, whereas others aren't so kind, where enemies gain conditions or damage to their attacks later. For me, this further improves the encounter variability. Returning to the Bonfire is where characters can rest and increase stats and gain more items and equipment. Between encounters, players are free to look at, swap and equip any treasure cards in the inventory and continue exploring without resting, but not all equipment may be suitable for your character. Each item in the treasure deck has a minimum stat requirement that your character must meet in order to equip it. As an example, if I wanted to equip the Fire Surge to my Pyromancer, I'd need to ensure their corresponding stat values for strength and intelligence are equal or greater than the value shown on the card. If they are, I'm able to equip the item. If not, you have 2 options, where you can visit the Firekeeper to increase the tier level of your stats, or visit the Blacksmith to see if they can offer more suitable equipment. Some equipment items are also upgrades for weapons and armour. As long as you meet the required stats, you can slide the card under the specific item type that provides an ongoing ability for as long as you have the upgrade attached. Paying souls from your cash to the Firekeeper allows you to increase 1 tier on your stats progression area, where you can increase any tier any number of times, noting that the cost of upgrade increases each time. And the cost for each tier is 2, 4 and 8 souls. Once you've paid for the upgrade, you're supposed to punch these tokens out, flip them upside down so they show the gold side. If you visit the Blacksmith, you draw 4 treasure cards and open up a market-like area. Here you can pay 1 soul per card you want and place it in the inventory that any player can then equip. This has changed from the original game where you would pay 1 soul to reveal just 1 card and choose to equip it or not. Initially, you would end up spending and wasting a load of souls drawing cards hoping to get something useful, because in a 3-player game there are at least 90 cards available. Plus it seemed the deck was poorly stacked, meaning you could be drawing cards not really suitable for your characters in the game. There are some good house rules to rectify this, but the core sets actually do this quite well. No cost to shop around and a small cost to buy items with just 45 common treasures in the deck. I'm not saying you get to equip everything you want immediately, but the character development is far superior in the core sets than it is in the original game, and you could combine cards from both sets for a more varied treasure deck. Each core set comes with 2 bosses that has a small deck of behaviour cards and a main card that shows its health and any special abilities. You'll meet 1 boss halfway down the campaign track and another main boss at the end that you'll need to defeat in order to win the game. When fighting a boss encounter, you'll draw 1 card from the boss behaviour deck and follow the actions for movement and attack. There are some differences to standard enemies for combat, where each boss miniature has arcs for front, rear and the sides, and the behaviour card will show the direction and the arc the boss attacks. So in this attack, the boss will target the front and side arcs, and attack all those nodes within one range radius. Dependent on the type of attack, some behaviour cards also show a weakened area, here highlighted in red, that allow characters an extra dice if attacking from that arc. When the boss moves, you'll need to rotate them to ensure they're facing in the correct direction. All the bosses come with a health tracker to mark damage. Boss fights are really well done in Dark Souls. They can be long due to the amount of health and abilities they have, such as turning invisible or regenerating. Each behaviour card for a boss is unique with regards to its movement, attack, arc direction and effect. When the deck runs out, you don't shuffle the behaviour cards, you simply turn them upside down so they're revealed in the same order, and you can now start to predict their actions for a time. Once you've inflicted a certain amount of damage to the boss, a random heat up card is then added to the deck. These are more powerful behaviour cards, where the deck is shuffled and you have to relearn the pattern, as well as contend with some formidable actions. There are more behaviour cards associated with each boss than you can bring to battle, so each time you face them, you'll generally end up with a behaviour deck containing different cards. After defeating the first boss, their encounter card acts as a bonfire tile, meaning you can restart here after resting. You also increase the spark dial by 1 as opposed to resetting it as before, and in some way this does balance some of the rule changes that I've mentioned earlier. After defeating the first boss, you also get additional cards that add to the treasure deck relating to boss equipment and legendary items that fill the deck with some pretty awesome weapons and armour, some of which are character specific. These core sets introduce new types of terrain as well as a change in rules for others. Gravestones now allow you to look at the top card from certain decks, and barrels provide souls at the end of an encounter and don't cost stamina to break. And a treasure chest can be searched using an action that provides a treasure card and also block movement. Levers cost an action and are used in some encounters, and torches can be picked up where the characters will always have the aggro token, so is useful if you have a tanked character or one with a high dodge value, and they also protect against the frostbite condition in some encounters. There are poison clouds in the painted world that give you the poison condition that will cause damage later in the turn, and in the Tomb of Giants there's a shrine token that's used as an objective in some encounters. You'll also likely come across traps that may force you to take a dodge roll to suffer damage. In the original base game, gravestones would block movement, so were handy to hide behind and allowed you to know some information about boss behaviour cards, but did not cost any actions to interact with, and treasures were just awarded at the end of an encounter. I do like the fact that you now have to interact with terrain, deciding over this or using a weapon. Conditions caused by attacks are mostly the same, where bleed and poison cause damage, and stagger increases the stamina cost of attacks. But frostbite is altered so that characters recover less stamina rather than using more to move, and in the Painted World set this condition pops up a lot. So what do I think of the core sets? Well, they're more streamlined and you can play through the game in less time than the original, although it's still fairly long, quite a few hours. You have less sparks over the course of the game, but you do gain many more souls from encounters, where I got 16 from one encounter with just 2 players, which is more than enough to upgrade a character stat from tier 1 to tier 3 in one go. I much prefer the updated rules for visiting the blacksmith, and therefore you have a better system for character development in these core sets. Some may feel encounter card objectives are not in line with the Dark Souls theme, but they introduce variability and high replay value, and you do get a choice of 2 each time. Although you get up to 6 enemies with each set, the encounter cards add special rules to increase health, damage and condition for enemies, so they feel different from the base versions and with each encounter. In one encounter you're taking on 2 snow rats, each with 1 health. Later in the game fighting just 1 with 10 health and increased damage, block, resist and dodge values. Although it would be beneficial if there were some modifier tokens we could place on the enemy card to help remind me of this. There's one encounter from the Painted World I'm not keen on at all. It's 2 tiles with just traps, but all you have to do is locate 3 blank tokens. It's pretty bland. I like fighting enemies, and this could be a tedious encounter at one player whose character has a low dodge value. Speaking of which, there's no boon for playing solo with one character for a true Dark Souls experience. I'm unsure how this will affect the game, but can only guess it's going to make the game quite difficult, where previously you started the game with 16 souls in the cache. Stamina recovery and use has been altered that I initially had to question, as in it's an important part of Dark Souls. However, some treasure cards have been updated to reflect these rule changes for balancing, and now you have to take actions to interact with terrain. I was surprised that the resist block rolls have been combined with the dodge rolls and that you get an option to spend stamina to move if successful. Does this make the game too easy? And if you have to use the word easy, is it really Dark Souls? To begin with, I thought so, but you don't reset the spark dial after the first boss, and you need to complete the whole game only gaining that one extra spark that's supported by faster character development and gaining more souls, and encounters also make enemies much tougher too. At first glance, it seems like an inchoate Dark Souls game. A box game like this with only 2 bosses can feel a little empty, considering you had 6 in the original, but you can mix content from both these core sets, meaning you have more varied encounters and a different combination of bosses, although this is solely down to your choice and preference. If you are new to Dark Souls, these core sets are a good starting place for a standalone experience for adventure. But you'll notice I'm using the term adventure, not campaign, when describing the game. Steamforged Games have said that they have developed a better campaign system, but I don't believe this to be a campaign style game, especially when compared to the likes of Gloomhaven, Descent or even Bardsong. For Dark Souls, I'm looking for a tough, deep and well built number of encounters, split between taking on multiple bosses, where I can then take any treasures and rewards from that part of the campaign to another area. Future encounters, enemies and bosses would then need to scale up to meet the development of the party, and of course there'd need to be an immersive story built in. The first game didn't do this well. I tried the campaign once and it didn't work. I know there have been some excellent fan-made house rules and developments to rectify this, but with the new core sets I thought some adaptation of these would have been included. Having only one mini and main boss to defeat to complete the game doesn't constitute a campaign to me. There's not even a direct link to each of the core sets, which is surprising. Horizon Zero Dawn did the exact same thing. You draw encounter cards, select one, lay out tiles and enemies, and try to meet the objective of the encounter with just one boss enemy. The original game, for me, it meant that the main boss treasure cards were largely unused. In these core sets, they now become available after defeating the mini-boss, but before you even meet the main boss, which thematically doesn't make sense. Unfortunately, that just shows any form of campaign development has been largely overlooked, which will disappoint fans of the original, especially those who have put in the hard work to create and release their own. What about compatibility? I have the original game, Kickstarter add-ons and a few expansions for enemies, bosses and characters. Steamforged Games have indicated there is backwards compatibility, but it's simply not there. Although I haven't looked at and compared every treasure card between the core sets and the original game, it does look like the common treasure cards from the original game have been split and divided into these core sets, so you're not going to want to incorporate them. Enemies can't be mixed, as the original encounter cards don't have special rules, objectives or keywords, so they're likely to be unbalanced. It seems you can bring the bosses from the core sets to the original and vice versa, but again there's no indicated if they're balanced and no mention anywhere in the rules that this can be done. It's all subjective. Now, the characters in these core sets are those from the character expansion from the original game. In theory, there is no reason as to why you can't bring the 4 characters from the main game, but it's important to note that there may need to be updates for these too. For example, Mercenary's starting weapon item in the core set has been changed to a 2-handed weapon, and they're able to attack twice, which is a subtle difference but a nice touch. As mentioned, there are some changes to other treasure cards with regards to stamina use and recovery. So, can we assume the original 4 characters are balanced? Think about the Herald. They allow other players to recover stamina. As there have been some big changes to stamina use, it seems fairly reasonable to believe that there should be some changes to the Herald's heroic ability, for example. It's not apparent, and Steamforged Games need to make it very clear what can be done based on previous play testing and not whatever you see fit. I also think that Steamforged Games need to be exceptionally clear on what is not compatible with these core sets. Those new to Dark Souls universe may end up buying one or both core sets plus older expansions from previous sets, not realising they're unbalanced or worse, completely incompatible because they're not cheap. If mixing the core sets, you'll need to understand that most of the event cards are clones. You'll need to pick out the few specific to the core set and then add them to the deck at setup. Are Steamforged games going to provide encounter cards for the new enemies usable in the original game, and encounter cards similar to those in the core sets with enemies from, say, the original game or Dark Root expansion? I really hope they develop upgrade packs for this exact purpose, as I'm not a fan of print and play. Why should I put in the effort? But for those who haven't played Dark Souls, these core sets provide a great survival horror, nice character development with a dungeon delve experience, but must note any compatibility with the original game looks to be up in the air. Essentially, they are standalone games that can be mixed with each other as a preference. If you're looking at the original game, you may want to check out the fan-made house rules for a better experience in my opinion. For the core sets, admittedly, I was sceptical, but I've enjoyed them much more than I thought I would, and overall I'm quite happy with the updated rules and mechanics, and will also look to include bosses and possibly characters from the previous versions in these games to see how I get on. They both provide a very rewarding dungeon crawling experience, especially with encounter progression system and multi-tile areas, terrain changes and new enemies that do make a solid game. However, you'll all be doing this in a game that still doesn't have a campaign system that I was looking for, and with characters and treasure cards that I was already familiar with, and any crossover components is only going to be what you decide. Out of the two sets, I probably prefer Tomb of the Giants. I think the enemies are bigger and better to fight against, and the encounters are slightly more engaging. The giant skeletons are great to battle against, but in the Painted World set, I do like the hollow phalanx enemies that can group together where you have to gradually chip away at the miniatures. Also, the artwork on the Painted World tiles is far superior. Lastly, I'm disappointed to say I've noticed a few print errors. The rulebook has a couple of images that don't correspond to text, showing a weapon card but indicating an armor upgrade, for example. Both the blank trap and heroic ability tokens have the same artwork on both sides, making it difficult to locate the blank traps and meaning you have to remove the heroic player token from your player board once used, as the reverse side also shows unused images. One of the encounter's cloak and feathers indicates you should refresh a player token but lists souls as the reward instead, and there is a treasure card, Mask of the Child, that allows you to recover 3 stamina each turn, but this is the base rule already. Lastly, in Tomb of the Giants, the skeleton soldier has a range attack of 1 even though they only cause damage with their move action, which is wrong. I've mentioned this to Steamforged Games, who said they would rectify this in the second print run. So there we go. The core sets are due for release early November, and I'm interested to hear what you think about them, and I'm happy to answer any questions in the comments. This is Ninja Geek Games. Cheers.